Okay.
Dr. Leventhal, you've developed quite an interest in school bullying in recent years. It's a hot topic. It's become something of social importance. How common is this across the child and adolescent years?
Well, it's actually remarkably common, which is one of the most significant problems with school bullying, because people often think if it's common, then it must not be that serious, and they get accustomed to it and tend to ignore it. In some communities, it can involve as many as 40 or 50% of the children, although I think if one looks across the childhood population in general, somewhere between 15 and 30% of children are involved in bullying at some point in their lives. Now, it looks different in different age groups, and the most flagrant forms of school bullying are seen in the grade school years, between 1st and 8th grade, peaking somewhere around 5th or 6th grade. However, it does continue into high school, and in fact, bullying, obviously not school bullying, continues into adulthood and is seen in many ways, like hazing in social groups or in the military, or it can be seen in things like road rage, or where people try to intimidate one another with tailgating and things like that. So it's a behavioral condition that has some continuity from early childhood all the way through adulthood, but it has a peak prevalence probably in mid to late childhood and continues on into adolescence. Now, one of the things that's interesting about it is that it's so common, and while it varies enormously across countries, and there have been international studies, so some Asian countries the rates are 45%, 47% of the children involved, to some countries where they do interventions where the rates are as low as 5 to 9, 10%. In the United States and the UK, it's about 25 to 30%. That because it's so common, people often think that it's a normal part of childhood, whatever normal means. And as a result, there's a general notion that children who experience bullying and learn to triumph over it will have stronger characters and be better. And so they're given the advice to go out and find the bully and punch him in the nose. Or, if they're the bully, then rather than the victim, that, these are weak people that you're just going to push aside, and this is just part of the competitive effort in the environment. And that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, there's more than ample evidence to suggest that people who are involved in bullying, irrespective of whether they're bullies, victims, or there are a smaller group of individuals who do both, they both are bullies and victims, can have long-term and very serious consequences. Their success in school is considerably lower than the general population. They're less likely to have good social skills and social relationships, and they're much more likely to develop various forms of psychopathology. And the rates can be quite high, and we recently published a paper showing that they actually have significantly increased rates of suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviors.
So if we were out in the community, what would a teacher or a parent or a community worker look for? How would we want to distinguish or characterize bullying against other forms of possibly difficult or ordinary behavior? What does it look like?
Well, it varies both in terms of age group, but also in terms of type and style of bullying. So bullying can be as straightforward as a group of children beating up another child, hitting them and physically hurting them. But that is not always the most common form of bullying. And it can take much more subtle forms, such as name-calling, spreading rumors, exclusion, social exclusion, intimidation of varying kinds. What distinguishes it from other kinds of behaviors are several characteristics. Number one, it's often a matter of power, where a person in the one child or a group of children in a position of strength are intimidating, not for any particular purpose, but in just intimidating another child. Whereas an antisocial child would intimidate a child to get money or food or something. This is just for the purpose of intimidation. The second thing is that it's often a group activity and rarely an individual activity, in that there may be one leader of the group, but others will either join in or be passive, seemingly passive bystanders, but who encourage the bullying behavior to take place. And then finally, the people who are victims are oftentimes people who may be smaller, maybe have some distinguishing physical characteristic, or aren't exactly the center of the social milieu. So a child who might be very smart, or a child who might have intellectual handicaps, wears glasses, has some deformity to their teeth. So children who are distinctive or disabled are much more likely to be victims along the way. And so there's this obvious power difference and a persistence and often a group activity, or at least where groups of people are involved in the bullying activity.
In the UK, there's a kind of stereotype that says that boys are bullies, girls are more likely to be victims. But if you look carefully, girls are pretty good at bullying too. It's just more covert. Are there sex differences across these behavioural characteristics?
Well, it would appear that in the grade school age, boys tend to be slightly more involved in bullying. But that may be an aberrant finding because the boys tend to be more physical and they tend to be more likely to be identified. By the time you get into adolescence, the sex differences disappear. The girls are more elegant at it. They tend to be much more subtle with rumor mongering and social exclusion, which can be much harder to detect and actually can be far more painful than getting hit physically. And so at that age range, it's quite common. By the way, at that point also, in the school age, it's mostly boys victimizing boys and girls victimizing girls. By the time you get into the high school or adolescent period, boys may be victimizing girls, and, although not well known, girls victimize boys by calling them names, spreading rumors about them, insulting their masculinity, if you will, at a time when they're very vulnerable. And so the pattern changes by the time you move into adolescence.
From your experience as a researcher and a clinician, what are the interventions that one has to start thinking about with this quite common, clearly quite severely impairing kind of behaviour?
Well, the first thing is the things you don't do, which may seem a surprising place to start, but the notion of sitting down a bully and a victim together and say, let's work out your differences, doesn't work, because they've already created a pattern of behavior where the bully is just going to victimize the individual again in that sort of setting. And what really seems to work is an intervention that is a large group intervention, because if it's that common, and it doesn't really usually occur in isolation. And in our studies, we've shown that one person who's a bully tends to bully many people. And people who tend to be victims are often victimized by many people. So it's part of a communal activity, not a favorable one, but not a communal activity. And so the best interventions appear to be ones that take and start to make an adjustment in the community. The beginning point is awareness. To say, this is what bullying looks like. And interestingly enough, when you do that, the children all know what it is. They can identify it quickly and highly reliably tell you who are the bullies and who are the victims in their social group, in their classroom, for example. Very quickly, easily, no problem. The teachers have a much tougher time, and the parents even have a tougher time. Now, they can always identify the one really bad bully and the one really severe victim, but most of the ones they miss completely. And so creating awareness, number one. Number two, saying that this is not acceptable behavior. So taking away the notion if you go punch them in the nose, it'll be good, but that bullying and a bullying response to it is not acceptable is the next thing. The third is to create, if you will, safety places where this is an area which will be well monitored by adults, where bullying cannot take place. And when it starts to take place, the adults say no, the kids can say no with impunity. Because when you're in the bathroom and one boy is bullying another and there's no supervision, you can't stand up to it. So you start to build a safe place where the practice of protecting each other from bullying begins, and then it spreads out. The last part of this is that most bullying programs that are successful are largely school-based but community-wide. They involve parents, teachers, the children, the staff at the school, the police in the community oftentimes, so that there becomes a general public awareness and a general statement that we're not going to accept this, and when we see it, we stop it. And it's an interesting phenomenon that often is led by children. because not unlike, I don't know what happened in the UK, but with the seatbelt phenomena where children were taught in schools, wear seatbelts, it's dangerous if you don't, and they would start telling their parents to put their seatbelts on. And so when you start to teach the children about this, and it starts to work for them, then when they see their parents call somebody a name or start to be intimidating even to one of the other children in the family or their spouse, they say, wait, that's bullying, we don't do that. And if the parents have been part of the educational program, they'll say, oh, yes, and then it starts to expand. So you can reduce the rates in these bullying programs from about half, maybe a little bit more in the short term, and they're relatively inexpensive. A full-scale bullying program, at least in the U.S., looks like it works out to between $5 and $7 a child for the whole intervention, so it's pretty cheap.
That sounds cost-effective and also clinically effective. What do you see around the corner? Where do we go over the next 10 years in policy terms and intervention terms?
Well, I think we have interventions that actually work, with the one caveat that there are a couple of groups of kids within the bullying group who are at very high risk for other kinds of psychiatric problems, in particular those children who are both bullies and victims, and the boys in that group, although the girls are just as problematic. They have very ominous outcomes. But for the rest, we have very effective interventions, and the question is how do we make it a public health priority? Not unlike child abuse became 50 years ago. This has the same, in fact, greater adverse consequences than child abuse did. And how do we make this a public health issue, not just in one country or another, but internationally? Unfortunately, countries are often bullies, and as a political entity, and that then gets transmitted down to the populace. And I think trying to shape that is going to be a real challenge for us and our colleagues in the public policy arena.
Dr. Leventhal, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this matter with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Good job.